If you're anything like me, then your video game backlog is huge. I have tons of great games in mine, and I think it's finally time I did something about it. This is DX's Backlog, a series dedicated to sharing my experience with games that I wish I hadn't waited so long to play. Today, we'll be returning to Rapture to take a look at 2K Marin's BioShock II and its DLC, Minerva's Den. This episode of the Backlog is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends. Stay tuned to learn more about the game, its new champion Ronda Rousey, and how you can get her for free. Now, let's dive back to the depths of Rapture. How do you build off of a title like BioShock? Making a sequel to such a special game seems like an overwhelming task, but BioShock 2 makes it look easy. This game is incredible, and one that I believe is an upgrade in nearly every possible way from the first game. That's saying a lot too, because as we've previously covered, I think BioShock 1 is amazing. BioShock 2 opens by putting us in the shoes of a big daddy named Subject Delta, and its gamification of BioShock 1 begins here. Gamification, or the act of being gamified, is when a game's systems are shifted more towards accommodating gameplay than narrative or atmosphere. Silent Hill is a great example of a series that was gamified over time. However, I think gamification actually works brilliantly for BioShock 2 and even empowers its narrative, which is incredibly rare. By playing as a Big Daddy, we get several gameplay opportunities that we didn't have playing as Jack in the first game. We've got a drill now, we can protect little sisters, and we have the chance to change characters' perceptions of what a Big Daddy is. The game's primary antagonist, Sophia Lamb, believes that the Big Daddy is a monster incapable of change. It's up to the player to challenge this belief, and the game lets us participate in this narrative by giving us choices that prove or disprove Sophia's ideology. In this aspect, I think BioShock 2's gamification works perfectly. I don't believe there's anything wrong with the presentation of story or player choice in the first game, but I do think BioShock 2's story feels a lot more personal because of our inclusion in it. The game as a whole feels a lot more personal than BioShock 1, almost as if the ideologies of the villains inform the stories of the games. Andrew Ryan was an individualist, and the story of BioShock 1 is about how Jack is used to further one man's selfish goals. Sophia Lamb, on the other hand, is an altruist, and the story of BioShock 2 is about Delta's desire and ability to help others. Making its protagonist a Big Daddy really helps to tell that more intimate story. Delta doesn't feel like a stranger in Rapture the way that Jack did, and because of this, BioShock 2 doesn't have to spend time educating the player on what happened in the city or any of its other lore. This lets 2 further emphasize the struggles of Rapture's citizens. I really enjoyed the back and forth audio logs between Ryan and Lamb. Fontaine out-enterprises Ryan, but I think Lamb hit him in a blind spot due to his sheer inability to empathize with others. It's not hard to see how Ryan's rhetoric would wear thin on people living in horrible inequality, and how Lamb's preaching of one Rapture family would appeal to them. Of course, Lamb is another of Rapture's great hypocrites. The utopian collective she strives so hard to create is no less ridiculous than Ryan's own idea of a city without need of regulation. BioShock 1 features meta-commentary about player choice, or lack thereof, and I think 2 positioning Lamb to be a character that we can choose to contrast with was the right direction to take the sequel in. BioShock 2 is very much a game about the choices we make, and that's a prevailing theme even within its gameplay loop. 2 is a much faster-paced game than 1, and this is the area you can see the largest amount of gamification. 2 overhauls many of the mechanics of the first game to provide us with a quicker and more player-oriented combat experience. No longer do we have to switch between plasmids and conventional weapons. We can use them both at the same time. Reload animations have been simplified and sped up. Tonics have been consolidated and new tonics added that give us even more control of its AI. Even hacking has been changed by becoming real-time and no longer stopping the action. BioShock 2's fast-paced action is actually something it shares with today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Everyone's heard of Raid, the hit mobile RPG with over 80 million players, but what you probably haven't been shown is the amount of depth the game has. When I started playing, I chose Elhain as my starter champion. She's a glass cannon focused entirely on attack, which made getting through the first chapter of Raid's campaign, K-Rock Castle, very easy. Along the way, I unlocked more champions like Crusader, who helped me form a better rounded team composition because the game functions on an affinity system. Elhain and Crusader made very short work of the first boss, Lord Chamfort, and the ability to replay missions made leveling up my other acquired legends like Sniper super simple. Raid has over 650 champions, with some of the coolest fantasy designs I've ever seen in a game. I was more than pleasantly surprised by the game's visual fidelity and graphics because I never thought mobile games could look this good. I talked about my experience with the campaign, but if you're more into PvP, Raid has that as well. You can put your champions up against other players in the arena. You can even join clans and face clan bosses with friends. Raid is continually getting updates, and one of its newest champions is none other than MMA legend Ronda Rousey, whose character is so versatile that she'll fit right into any composition and be an excellent addition to any team. If you play Raid for 7 days between now and February 20th, you can unlock Ronda for free. You can scan the QR code on screen or use my link in the description to download the game and receive in-game bonuses, including another epic champion named Tyrell. In the game itself, you can also use promo code RAIDRONDA to get a 3-day 100% XP boost, 500,000 silver, and 5 full energy refills. Now, back to BioShock 2. Most of the changes to the gameplay seem to have been done for BioShock 2's main combat edition, Gathering. After slaying another Big Daddy, you're able to adopt their little sister. Instead of just rescuing or harvesting them, you're now able to gather Adam from corpses around the area. You have to protect your little sister while she gathers, and you're given many tools for this task specifically. There's trap rivets, mini turrets, spear traps, alongside all new tonics and plasmid features. My favorite strategy was to intentionally mess up the hacking to activate the alarm and the security bots. Then I'd use the shutdown panel and hack 2 disabled bots to help me with the gather. This only got better once I got the handyman tonic that allowed me to heal the bots. All of this made BioShock 2 feel like a management game, and I loved that about it. I even loved fighting Big Sisters because I'd have everything set up so that splicers, brutes, bots, or other Big Daddies would fight half the battle for me and distract them. BioShock 2 is a game where your creativity and ability to manage resources is rewarded, but I feel like I would use all of these mechanics no matter what, because the combat is so damn fun. I enjoyed it so much that I did every single gather in the game, and by the end of it, I was able to max out multiple plasmids because I had more Adam than I knew what to do with. This game's final level is some of the most fun I've ever had in a final stage, just because of how much I was able to control about the fight and how cool the final plasmid upgrades are. It's worth noting that this shift in combat did come at a cost. I said in the last episode of the Backlog that BioShock 1's level design felt like it was from a survival horror game, because of its focus on exploration and backtracking. This isn't really present in 2 because the levels are built around gathers and have to accommodate the mechanic, but I think that's fine. I'm happy that both games have different design approaches and that both work so well for their respective games. This still feels like a sequel to BioShock while expanding on it greatly. BioShock 2 even does this for its environments. Rapture's look in the first game was based on architecture from New York in the 1930s, but many of the new areas in BioShock 2 feel very southern. Something else the game does well is transitioning between architectural themes depending on the player's location. Hopper's Drop early in the game feels like Louisiana, but as the game progresses, BioShock 2 gradually returns to the Art Deco look of the first game by the time we get to Fontaine Futuristics. I am genuinely surprised by how much I like the story of this game. I thought that it would be hard to beat the intrigue and shock created by 1, but the people working on BioShock 2 clearly knew that would be impossible, so they opted to tell a different kind of story, and one that I found even more appealing. At the beginning of the game, Subject Delta is ambushed and separated from his little sister by her biological mother, Sophia Lamb. 10 years later, Delta is mysteriously revived in a Vita chamber and sets out to find his little sister, who is now known to us as Eleanor Lamb. Like I said, I think BioShock 2 is a lot more personal than 1, and this is something the game begins imposing on the player from the start of the game, by taking action against them instead of having them be an observer of the world. Playing as Delta, I felt very motivated to make my way back to Eleanor, as the game kept showing me that Sophia Lamb was completely unstable, and her grip on Rapture needed to come to an end. Something else that surprised me about BioShock 2 was how the levels never felt stale, despite the repetition associated with the gameplay in them. I thought that, even with as much fun as I was having with Gathering, that it would eventually become tiring and a chore, but every level has its own novelty that separates it from the previous one to break up any potential monotony with the combat. I was enamored with the Fontaine Futuristics level just because of Gil Alexander's presence and how Alex the Great tries to eliminate Delta throughout it. I also loved the unstable teleporting plasmid you had to chase around, and the entire basement research facility, which features an additional goal and the conclusion of one of the game's subplots. The Persephone levels, which are the game's final 2, were my favorites. The game very wisely has no gathers in either of these, as I think it probably realized that the mechanic had run its course with the player and that we'd done enough of them. They play out more linearly and feature a fantastic blend of gameplay and story as Delta finally makes it to Sophia and Eleanor. There's a lot of twists and turns in these 2 levels, along with the game's last big fight. Like I mentioned, I don't remember the last time I had this much fun in a game's final fight. BioShock 1's final boss was a bit rough, and I don't think it stuck the landing in terms of bringing together all of the game's combat mechanics in a satisfying manner. BioShock 2 skips a final boss fight entity altogether, and has you fighting a large horde of enemies that actually mirrors the types of fights you've been having in the game up until now. It's the game's biggest test of how you're able to control the flow of combat with all the fun tools the game gives you, and I had a blast doing it. I can't say too much about this game's ending without massively spoiling the game, so I'll just say this. I love the ending of BioShock 2. It's one of my favorite game endings, right alongside the ending of BioShock 1. Now, there is more to BioShock 2 than its main story, and that brings us to Minerva's Den, BioShock 2's DLC campaign. Minerva's Den, although short and sweet, is one of the best DLCs I've ever played. It feels even more intimate than the base game, due to its level design and story, which sees another Big Daddy named Subject Sigma guided through a new area of Rapture that houses the Thinker, a supercomputer responsible for nearly all of Rapture's automation. This too is a personal story, and one that uses the medium of video games to their full potential to tell it. Subject Sigma is directed around Rapture Central Computing by one of the Thinker's creators, Charles Milton Porter. Porter is the DLC's greatest triumph, managing to create a sympathetic and relatable character in under 4 hours with just voiceover and environmental storytelling. Sigma is responsible for collecting the Thinker's programming and bringing it to Porter before he leaves Rapture. On the gameplay side of things, Minerva's Den's levels are very compact and reminiscent of BioShock 1, feeling more survival horror than the base game, while still including Gathering. Minerva adds in new weapons, plasmids, and enemies to freshen up combat, and it works just as well here as it did in 2. Minerva doesn't attempt to reinvent the franchise, but its additions do just enough to separate it from the base game so it doesn't immediately feel tired and played out. It's also very well paced, as you start out with considerably more health and Eve than you do in BioShock 2, and you regain your entire arsenal of weapons from 2 very quickly. Minerva's Den is smart enough to not overstay its welcome. Like I said, it's short, but I think it needed to be short. Not just for the already exhausted gameplay loop to not bore the player, but also because the story it's telling did not need to be any longer than it is. As if the ending of BioShock II itself wasn't emotionally impactful enough, the very last stretch of Minerva's Den is a beautiful segment that I think uses the best aspects of games to immerse us in its story. Charles Milton Porter is an excellent character, and Minerva's Den is an excellent expansion and companion to an incredible game. I think it's safe to say that I love BioShock 2, and that I think it's even better than the first game. For me, personally, I prefer 2 because I relate to the story better and also find the gameplay a lot more exciting. Though I have compared the two quite a bit today, I love both games, and I think they should be experienced together because they complement each other so well. I'm so happy I played BioShock 2, and it comes highly recommended as the last chapter in the Book of Rapture. Thanks again to today's sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Don't forget to check out the game by clicking the link in the description if you're interested. Remember, if you have a backlog, don't hesitate to get started on it. I know it can be easy to keep playing the one game you're always playing, or to go from new release to new release, but the experience you're looking for, or didn't even know you wanted, may be buried in the games you haven't gotten to yet. Games give us perspective, and every game I play teaches me something and slightly changes the way I view everything else. Just start with one game, and in no time you'll have gone to countless faraway lands and had invaluable fun along the way. Thank you for watching DX's Backlog. I'll see you next time.